I was thinking about the subject, and I was trying to find something between your two vocations, intellectual and political one. Shlomo Avineri is a political philosopher. For those who do not know, he is famous because his works on Marx, on Hegel, on the early Zionist leaders and intellectual, but he was also in diplomacy. He was General Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs at a certain time, participating in the negotiation with the Palestinian side sometimes. So, and writing a lot in international journals, commenting Israeli policy, Middle East politics, and more general subjects. Also, actually, on post-communist world and communist world as well. Actually, the first time I met, a small anecdote, Shlomo Avineri, it was in '87, you do not remember, it was in the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington. Shlomo was invited to talk about changes in Soviet Union, '87, and he shocked the public. There's a lot of intellectuals, but also people from the administration. Or he was saying that there is a fundamental clash between a sort of ideology which he pretended then still is important as a legitimacy for us, and the practice, and that this is destabilizing factor. And he was one of the few then predicting profound changes, although I don't think that you predicted going that far changes, but still, I remember this discussion. The subject I suggested to Shlomo to speak about, it is very general. We have very limited time. This is the problem of, in a way, changing alliances, new enemies, new friends. How old friends are becoming maybe not enemies, but certainly not friends and not allies of Israel, and another way around. How it happens that the people of the right, who were against, where the tendencies, anti-Semitic, were very strong, how happened that both in the US and in Europe are becoming the enthusiasts of Israel. So those changes of alliances also as a way of talking about Israeli politics. So this is, now it's up to you what you will choose as a real subject of your talk, Shlomo. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here at the Foundation, and it's a very short visit to Warsaw, but I'm very glad that I'm able to be here. Out of the different issues which were raised, I think I'm going to focus on three dimensions, which in one way or another may suggest to you not the Israeli view from inside. There are 7 million Israelis' views, but my view. But it is trying to suggest to you some aspects which are viewed from the inside, which may be different from the way in which Israel and the whole Middle East is being viewed from the outside. I'm not suggesting this is the only adequate or the only correct way of looking at it, but it is certainly a view that should be taken into account. And I'm going to focus on three issues, not in an order, well, in some sort of order, but not necessarily of importance. One is the outcome of the Israeli elections. Secondly, what's happening in the state system in the Middle East, and I'll explain later what I mean by state system. And thirdly, the issues that have to do with Iran. So first of all, Israeli elections. It's not a secret, so let me say that I'm a member of the Labour Party. I greatly hoped that the Zionist alliance, which was an alliance of the Labour Party and Tzipi Livni's centrist Labour Party, would win the election. He didn't win the election, and I'm greatly disappointed. But I'm not surprised. Both in Israel and outside of Israel, there was a surprise that at the end of the day, Netanyahu won the elections. And one of the reasons, well, first of all, a lot of people hoped that he would lose. So, you know, when he won, people were not only disappointed, but surprised. But some of the surprise has to do with the picture which was produced both in Israel and outside of Israel due to public opinion polls. And public opinion polls suggested in the weeks before the election, and even on the day of the elections, that Netanyahu is in deep trouble and is going to lose the election. And this raises an issue about the veracity of public opinion polls. As a political scientist, I sometimes say that the difference between political or social science and public opinion polls is sometimes like the difference between astronomy and astrology. We look at the same stars, but the methodology is different. And by this I mean something very specific, at least in Israel, but also outside of Israel. Public opinion polls, when it comes to elections, are based on a random sample, which is okay, but usually between 20 to 25% of the people who are asked refuse to give answers. And the idea is that those who refuse to answer are distributed more or less the same way in which those who give answers are distributed. But this is not necessarily the case. So when you have elections in a proportional system like Israel, when a switch of 4 or 5% either way makes the difference, and then you have 20-25% of people who did not answer, those are the people who in the end are going to make the decision about the elections. So the projections were based on a sample of 80%, and the 20% who did not answer are not distributed the same way. And the same appeared at the end of the day in the exit polls. Now Netanyahu, who is a catastrophic prime minister as far as I'm concerned, is a very good campaigner. And a lot of people underestimated his ability, and sometimes a very cynical ability, to use all kinds of images, some of them even racist, on the day of the election, but it worked. And most of what worked, and one has to understand it, that Netanyahu in a way was not running against Yitzhak Herzog, the head of the Zionist Alliance, he was running against the President of the United States. And Obama, for all kinds of reasons, is not very popular in Israel, not just among Likud supporters, he's not very popular in Israel, basically because of a perception, which is partly true and partly exaggerated, that not that he's anti-Israeli, this is nonsense, but that his mindset is very different from what Israelis usually expect of a mindset of an American president, be he a Democrat or Republican. Just very briefly an example, immediately after being elected the first time, Obama came twice to the Middle East, once to Istanbul and Ankara, and then to Cairo. American presidents don't visit the Middle East twice within a year. But here you had an American president coming to the Middle East twice in a year, visiting 2 Muslim countries and not visiting Israel. This was viewed by many Israelis, also people on the left, as something which means that he doesn't care, that this is not at the center of his concern. And when after the Cairo meeting he went to Buchenwald and made a very moving speech, because I mean Obama, like Netanyahu, is a good speechmaker, not a good statesman, but a good speechmaker. He made a speech at Buchenwald about the Holocaust in order to balance the visit to Cairo. This was again viewed by many Israelis as the wrong message. I mean, Israel is not just about the Holocaust. The Holocaust is, of course, a very tragic and important element in the Israeli self-consciousness, but it is not the justification, not the legitimacy, and not the mindset of most Israelis who view themselves as what they are, not just because of the Holocaust. So running against Obama, especially when Obama appeared to make an agreement with the Iranians, which is at least problematic, I'll come to it back later, made it very popular for Netanyahu to run against Obama. Which means a lot of Jewish chutzpah, once again, against the President of the United States, but politically it was powerful. To my mind, the outcome was not a switch to the right. Now, the switch to the right was compared to public opinion polls. But you have to compare the outcome of the elections to the previous elections. And when you compare these election results to the previous elections, which were just 2 years ago, so not a very long time, these elections are basically a status quo outcome. Very briefly, the Zionist Alliance, which is the alliance of the Labour Party with Tzipi Livni's party, received the same amount of seats in parliament as they had separately in the previous elections. They did not win the elections, they did not increase their vote, but they didn't lose whatever their support was. So, the left, the center-left, remained what it was before. Strong, powerful, not powerful enough to win an election. But this was the case also in the previous elections. On the other side of the map, if you look at the right-wing bloc, which is made up basically of three parties. Netanyahu's Likud, Avigdor Lieberman's Israel is our home, and Naftali Bennett's National Religious Party, which is called the Jewish Home, or the Jewish House. Those three parties received in these elections 1 seat less than they received in the previous elections. However, the internal distribution among those three parties changed. Both the Lieberman party and the Bennett party lost between 50% and 40% of the electorate and the voters and the seats in parliament, and those who did not vote for Lieberman and Bennett these elections and voted for them in the previous election didn't go to Labour. They went to the less extreme right-wing party, which is Likud. So we, in a very paradoxical way, on one hand, this was a status quo elections in terms of the left-wing and right-wing balance, and within the right-wing there was a switch from the two extreme nationalist parties, one of them really pretty nasty and racist, to a less extreme right-wing party. I don't want to say moderate right-wing party because to my mind the right-wing people are not moderate, but that's a less extreme right-wing party. So it is not the sort of switch to the right, catastrophic move to the right that has been presented because of the gap between the outcome and the predictions. But I mean, you don't compare astronomy to astrology. Astrology is astrology, and astronomy is astronomy. And I'm saying it because we have been burned with this sort of false predictions before. Now, what is going to happen now, I do not know. But Netanyahu receiving the largest number of seats, 30. I mean, his party grew, and it grew not because people from the left moved to it, but people from the more extreme right moved to his party. He's going to be the next prime minister. The question is what kind of coalition he's going to set up. Until a few days ago, almost complete conventional wisdom in Israel was that he's going to set up a right-wing coalition with Lieberman's party and Bennett's party and some of the Orthodox parties. In the last few days, there is a little switch in the discourse in Israel, and I don't want to rule out the possibility of a national unity government, Likud and the Labour, in order to have Bennett and Lieberman out of the government. For Netanyahu, and you could see it in the way he has expressed himself and also from internal evidence, Netanyahu realized that if he's going to set up a government with Bennett and Lieberman, the delegitimation of his government in the democratic West will just deepen. And he won the elections in his way, in his nasty, if you wish, cynical way, but he has to govern. And he would like to have support outside of Israel. And with Bennett and Lieberman, the support is going to be, there will be much more criticism, not only of him, but also of his partners. So for him to have Labour and have Herzog as a possible foreign minister is going to make it much more easy to re-establish his credibility for what it is worth, but also the credibility of Israel outside the country. For Labour, there is a not easy debate in Labour. I mean, some people in Labour are saying we lost the election and we should be in opposition, which is an understandable position and perhaps morally even the highway. But there are other people who say, well, we lost the election, but we didn't lose in terms of losing seats. We didn't. We maintained what we were before. But we also have a responsibility towards what kind of government Israel is going to have. Do we, as people of Labour, want to have an Israeli government with Bennett and Lieberman, who are, to many Israelis, totally beyond the pale? Netanyahu had a nasty campaign, but you know, the Likud is a right-wing nationalist party. It's not an extremist party. Labour has a deep disagreement with it, but this is not Bennett and Lieberman who really belong to, I don't want to use nasty names, but that's where they belong. So there is a debate within Labour. I'm not sure how it will end. I'm not sure whether Netanyahu is really interested in having Labour in, or this is just a ploy in the very complex negotiations about coalition. But I don't want to rule it out. So if it's going to happen, I'm not going to be surprised. I'm not sure it's going to happen. But this is a possibility which until a few days ago was almost totally ruled out. That's point number one. Point number two, and this brings me to some of the aspects that Alec mentioned before, the Middle East. To start from the end, what we see in the Middle East now is not just the emergence of a pretty murderous fanatical group like ISIS, the Islamic State, or Daesh, as it's been called by its Arabic acronyms. ISIS, the Islamic State, got a lot of free publicity, mainly because of some terrible photogenic videotapes of decapitation. I mean, it's powerful. It made people think that those people are going to occupy Berlin, Paris, London, and perhaps even New York within the next few days. And this is, I mean, it's totally hysterical. This is pretty awful and pretty nasty, and in a way, powerful group. But this is not an Islamic invasion of Europe or danger of Islamic invasion. Europe has problem with an Arab and Muslim minority, with which Europe has not yet come to terms with. But the problem in the Middle East is much more different. And what we see in the Middle East is a change of the map of the Middle East. The map of the Middle East, which all of us anyway grew up, sees the countries like Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Libya and Sudan or Yemen, and we see them on the map. But all of those countries, and I didn't mention Egypt because Egypt is a very different story, and of course Israel, Palestine is much more complicated. All those countries were an outcome of the victory of the French and the Brits in World War I, and the way in which British and French diplomats and administrators divided the spoils of the disintegrating Ottoman Empire. In 1915, two diplomats, Sir Mark Sykes and François Georges Picot, French diplomat, signed an agreement which was secret. It was published only after the Communist Revolution, and it was published by Lenin as part of the secret imperialist treaties. In this treaty, Britain and France decided not only to divide the Middle East among themselves, but decided how to divide it. And they decided, not out of respect to the population, but because of their interest and the power balance between the two countries, to set up a separate Iraq, a separate Syria, a separate Lebanon. None of these countries existed in this way as independent entities ever in the history. There were other kingdoms and empires and everything. And certainly not in the borders which were drawn sometimes in the sand, and that's why some of the borders in the Middle East are so very nice and straight, because people were sitting with a map and made a line in the sand. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is as crucial to the Middle East as Versailles or Trianon to this area, Sykes-Picot was an outcome of an imperial division of the former Ottoman Empire. It overlooked history, it overlooked geography, it overlooked ethnicity, it overlooked religious affiliations, and certainly nobody asked the people involved. People were not asked whether they would like to have an independent Iraq or independent Syria. No, the British and the French decided this is going to be a separate state, and they put, I wouldn't like to say they're puppets, but they're allies as kings or presidents, and this was an imperial division. After those areas, which initially were mandates and then became independent after World War II, and some of them before World War II, there was an interest of the elites to maintain the status quo. And this status quo was challenged twice. It was challenged in the limited case of Iraq by the American or whatever, the Western invasion. And it was challenged later by the turbulence of the Arab Spring, which did not bring about democratization because of reasons that have to do with the weakness of civil society, etc., in the Arab world. But they challenged the status quo. And as a consequence of that, we have today at least 5 countries which were established by Western imperialists in different ways as Westphalian nation states, so to speak, being disintegrated. Iraq has disintegrated already after the American invasion, and the Kurdish regional government in the north, which is called an autonomy without Iraq. It's a de facto state. Those of us who've been there have seen it. This is a separate entity. There are embassies there of all Western powers, and not called embassies, they're called consulates, because there is a fiction that this is part of Iraq. But the Kurds, who have had in the last few months some problems with ISIS, have their own army. The Iraqi army does not exist in the Kurdish areas. They have their own economic and financial arrangements having to do with oil. They have a very good relationship now with Turkey, which may be surprising, but it is the case. And I cannot imagine that Iraq will be back to what it was under Saddam Hussein and before as a unified Arab nation state. And of course the divide between the Shia majority in Iraq and the Sunni minority in Iraq, which is now a very violent divide, people are fighting each other, suggests that it may even be difficult to see the rest of Arab Iraq unified as a coherent political structure. In Syria, despite views that were the views of the military establishment in the West, but also in Israel, that Assad is not going to last. I mean, 3 years ago, people were talking about a few weeks and months. Assad managed to survive, but he doesn't control the territory of all of Syria. He controls certain areas. He controls Damascus. He controls the Alawite mountain coastline. He's Alawite. This is a Shiite group. The Alawites are 10% of the population of Syria. 60% are Sunnis, and the rest are Christian, Arabs, and Jews. And when you look today at Syria, you have a country that has disintegrated into 4 or 5 areas with local militias, some Sunni extremists, some Sunni less extremists, Jews. You have even a group like Yazidis, about whom very few people in the West have ever heard. And to imagine that Syria, whoever is going to come out winning, is going to be again a coherent political structure, probably not going to happen. Libya post-Gaddafi disintegrates into the historical entities of Libya, because Libya as an entity was set up in 1911 as part of the Italian attempt to create a North African empire. And the 2 provinces, Tripolitania with Tripoli and Cyrenaica in the east with Benghazi, are very different. They've never been together. They've been 2 very different provinces of the old Ottoman Empire. The Arabic dialects in both sides are very different. The west with Tripoli belongs to the Maghreb, the west, and the east with Cyrenaica is much more closer to Egypt and the Mashraq, the Oriental Middle East. So you have today a situation post-Gaddafi in Libya where you have 2 governments, 2 parliaments, 2 or 3 strong military groups and dozens of militias. To imagine, as some people in Washington think, that you have just to bring everybody in and they're going to sign an agreement. Maybe they're going to sign an agreement, but that's not the point. There is no force at the moment, not even a military force, that can put those 2 parts together. In Yemen, we see a disintegration of Yemen along to both geographical and religious groups, Sunni versus Shia. So we see, and in Sudan we have already seen the emergence of South Sudan. Darfur may still become eventually independent, and again Sudan was set up as a British imperialist at the end of the 19th century. So we see the disintegration of the quasi-Westphalian system, which was transplanted to the Middle East by Western imperialists. It lasted 1 century, almost a century, which is not to be overlooked, but once it was challenged, the identity of people shifted. And again, those are not religious wars in the theological sense. The difference between Shias and Sunnis, theologically or religiously, is not very, very deep. However, religion is not about God. Religion is about identity. And when a state structure in Syria or Iraq disintegrates and people stop viewing themselves as Iraqis or Syrians, But the Shias or Sunnis or Alawites or Yazidis or Druze, this really creates a problem for the attempt to reimpose a unitary form of government. I have no idea where this is going to lead. I mean, 3 years ago, very few people heard about ISIS, Islamic State. They have now set up something they call caliphate. I don't imagine it's going to be a coherent caliphate. But the challenge to the state system as we have known it is almost as far-reaching as a challenge to the old Yugoslavia. At least in the case of Yugoslavia, you had the 6 or 7 republics, which are the core of the present post-Yugoslav, post-Titoist system. Here, you have sub-state forces like local militia, and you have transnational forces like ISIS, like the Islamic State. Which way it will go, I do not know, but to imagine that the map of the Middle East will be this map of those coherent Syria, Iraq, Libya, that we know is probably not going to happen. And this really means that we're going to have a long period of instability and wars by proxies. In the case of Iran, but in the case of Syria, it's very clear who supports the local powers. In Yemen, the Iranians support the Houthis because the Houthis are Shias. In Saudi Arabia supports the ousted president, Hadi. In the case of Syria, a little bit more complicated, but Iran supports Assad because Assad is Alawi and the Alawites are Shias. I mean, dissenting Shias, but they are Shias. So you see the religious aspects of identity are linked with regional power struggles between Iran on one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. I want to underline that Egypt is a very different story. For all its internal problems and the switch from a Mubarak dictatorship to an open-ended democratic elections that brought to power the Muslim Brotherhood, which was then overthrown by a new military dictatorship, suggests that the alternatives in Egypt, despite what we have seen on TV, are a little bit difficult. The CNN and Al Jazeera effect, that all of us in a way were very much impressed, because we saw for weeks very courageous group of mainly young people, mainly secular, English-speaking, at least those of them were interviewed at CNN, using smartphones and wearing jeans and T-shirts, and people in the West thought, also in Israel, not everybody, but a lot, thought, this is a new Egypt. Egypt has 85 million inhabitants. No, not all of them have smartphones. Most of them don't have electricity and running water. And what we saw at Tahrir Square, 500,000, perhaps at 1.1 million, is not 85 million. So when you had elections, you had people voted either for the traditional view of themselves as Muslims, or then, when things switch a little bit, a very large group of the secular demonstrators against Mubarak are now supporting President Sisi, because if they have to choose between an authoritarian system under military rule and an Islamic fanatical oppressive system that will tell them how to dress and what to say and how to appear, some of those intellectual elites choose a military dictatorship rather than Islamic fundamentalism. And I don't envy them the kind of choice they had to make, and some of them made. Some of them we know individually, and those are people who brought down Mubarak with the hope of democracy, and ended up supporting another military dictator. This is a very tough choice, which reflects the reality in Egypt. But Egypt is a coherent country. It was not set up by Sykes-Picot. Egypt then has been there for millennia, and even the Christian Egyptians, the Copts, view themselves and are viewed by the Muslim majority as Egyptian. The borders of Egypt are more or less clear. There are no internal division, except that there is a Christian group which is respected, sometimes persecuted, but respected as Egyptian. So in Egypt you have internal problems, but Egypt is not disintegrating like some of the countries around it. Which brings me to the last point, which also means that some of the divisions in the Middle East are changing. It's not that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is going to disappear. It's not going to disappear. On the other hand, I do not think it's going to be solved very, very quickly, because there were failures not just because of Netanyahu. Netanyahu can be criticized, so can be the Palestinians. But an Israeli government 9 years ago under Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak and Tzipi Livni negotiated with the Palestinian Authority. Ehud Olmert was a centrist prime minister who, I think, never mind the corruption issues, but when it came out to the Palestinian issue, he was moderate and was honestly interested in an agreement. He met with Abu Mazen 36 times, as he said on TV. Most of us never heard that it was 36, but we thought it was 10 or 12, 36, which suggests that you can also keep certain things secret in Israel, which is unusual. Kissinger once said that Israel is the Israeli government is the only vehicle that, the only vessel that leaks from the top, not from the bottom. Everything comes from the leaks. But the fact there were 36 meetings, and when you meet on negotiations at the top level 36 times and you do not reach an agreement, it suggests that there are some very fundamental disagreements between the most moderate Israeli position and the most moderate Palestinian position. On borders, Jerusalem, refugees, security, settlements, etc. So while this is not going to disappear, neither is it going to be solved very quickly, the new map of the Middle East suggests some, not alliances, but some implied common interests between Israel and some of the Arab Sunni moderate states. With Egypt, Israel has a peace treaty which was able to survive even a year and a half of Muslim Brotherhood dominance, which suggests that it's not a love treaty, it's a peace treaty, it's based on realpolitik, it's based also, in the case of Egypt, of an interest to focus on internal issues which are economic and financially very different, and not get involved in another external war. With Saudi Arabia, Israel has, below the radar, had always contacts, and those contacts are now a little bit more intensive, even that you have a government led by Netanyahu, because the interests vis-à-vis Iran, which are different from the Israeli point of view and different from the Saudi and the Egyptian point of view, there still is a convergence of interests. Which leads me to the framework agreement. I have to say it carefully. There are 7 million Israelis who are experts on Iranian nuclear developments. I have a great aunt who is almost 100 years old. All her life, she never cared, never understood politics. She was interested in nice clothes and young men. Now she is an expert, not on politics, she's expert on Iranian nuclear development. And when I come to visit her, she tells me about centrifuges. She tells me about uranium isotope 235, 237, about plutonium. I mean, for a lady at her age and with her background, this is incredible. Why? Because she sits in front of TV and sees this every day, every day. When I was Director General of the Foreign Ministry, I sat for 2 years on the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. And then I found out how much I do not know. And this was many years ago. So I'm sure I do not know even more or even less today than I did before. In contradiction to my great aunt who knows everything. I do not. And as one should never quote an American former Secretary of Defense who said there are things we know, and there are things that we know that we do not know, and there are things that we do not know that we do not know. But, you know, this is, in terms of epistemology, a very interesting statement coming not from a philosopher, but from a very problematic American Secretary of Defense that is right. I do not know. And most of what we read in the newspapers and what we hear from American leaders, Iranian leaders, and Israeli leaders is propaganda. And some of it is true and some of it is not true, but I have no way of distinguishing. But there are at least 3 issues which one should look at very carefully when one looks at the framework agreement which was reached in Lausanne. I mean, the problem is that we have already two versions of the framework, one the American and one the Iranian. The Iranians have said that what the Americans are saying is a lie, and I think both of them are right. I mean, both of them are presenting what is to them the more favorable version. So we don't really know, but there's, I think, three issues that should be addressed and can be addressed in the negotiations leading to a final agreement, and I think here the Europeans can play an important role. Because until now the Europeans have been very quiet on this. One is the issue of verification and implementation. Now, the way the framework is presented is that there will be a very tough regime of verification. That there will be a mechanism that will make sure that the Iranians are going to abide by what they have signed. On a rhetorical level, that's okay. The question is, what is a mechanism? What are the institutional structures? What are the penalties? Iran has been for the last 20 years lying to the IAEA, and she has been part of the NPT, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and she's been able to do things which obviously were not only concealed but lied upon, and they got away with it. So what is the system? We need to have the details, and I'm not sure what they're going to be. But just to say that they're going to be tough implementation measures, okay, what are they? They should be spread out in order to get credibility to the agreement. The second issue is, what happens, and this is an outcome of the first one, what happens if Iran doesn't live up to the agreement? That there are, imagining that there is an effective system of verification, and this effective system of verification will find out that Iranians are doing things against the agreement. What happens the next day? The way it's being now presented by the United States, at least, and I'm not sure this is going to be the end of the story, is that there will be consultations. Well, thank you very much. Iranians are developing nuclear weapons against the agreement, and the West will consult. Well, we have had consultation for the last 15 years. One of the American answers is that there are going to be consultations about renewal of sanctions. Well, with Western companies investing in Iran, and the Russians are already not only investing, but they're doing more than that in Iran at the moment. Overnight, this will stop. There will not be political pressures from German companies, from American companies, from Italian companies, not to hurt the multi-billion investment in Iran. It's going to be automatic renewal of sanctions, and the sanctions until now have not really worked. Now, one needs a much more effective answer to the question, what happens if the Iranians do not live up to the agreement? Not the use of force, no, but some effective mechanism. I do not know what they are, but I haven't heard that they exist, or they're being part of the agreement. And the third issue is the missile development. The agreement, the framework agreement, just deals with nuclear development. It does not address another aspect of Iranian rearmament or armament policy, which is developing long-range missiles, and they have been relatively effective. Now, they need those missiles for what? And long-range missiles with nuclear warheads have a very different strategic meaning than long-range missiles with conventional warheads, which are bad enough. This is not part of the agreement. So Iran will be able to develop its missile program. There will be no, according to the framework, this is not part of the agreement, there are not going to be any sort of control or any sort of constraints. Now those are three very difficult issues. And one of the problems is that because of Netanyahu's demagogic demonization of the agreement and of Iran and of Obama, those real issues have been overlooked. They are very serious issues, and if they will not be addressed at the end of the day and the agreement will not give adequate answers to the first two ones and include the third one, which until now was not even negotiated, if there's going to be agreement, this is not going to be the end of the story, it's going to be the beginning of a completely different story, and I hope it's not going to be apocalyptic. I don't think it's going to be apocalyptic. But the agreement as it looks now, unless those issues are addressed, is a very feeble foundation for a system of control. This is not to make it analogous to the START agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is utter nonsense. This is something very, very different. It has to be addressed. I think at this stage that should be.
Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours. Please, for short questions. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about a side issue to what you spoke about, but I think it is quite important for the region and the perception of the region. And I'd like to refer to what Alexander Smola started with, the concept of the tension between the basic normative or utopian assumptions of a system and its everyday realities. At least as it is seen from abroad, there is a profound change in the construction of the Zionist ideology in Israel. The classical Zionist had very strong utopian or normative fundaments, and the debate on the tension between these fundaments of the Zionist project and the realities of the life in the Israeli state were also quite important, or used to be quite important as a political factor, both within the Israeli political community and in relation with other countries or other communities. Nowadays, as it may be seen from Europe, the present-day Zionist project is not so much constrained or empowered by this utopian tension. It's rather a raison d'etat ideology or ideology of bare life, which takes the sheer existence of the state as a rationale for the politics. And I'd like to ask you how correct is this description in your eyes, and what may be the political consequences of this profound change, if this change is truly the case.
Okay. This is a very specific and very profound question, and I'd like to answer it in some detail. I think the way you present it is correct, but it's only part of the picture. Amos Oz once said that Zionism is not a private name, it's a family name. Tzionut ze loshen prati shem mishpacha. Which means that there are all kinds of Zionisms. There's liberal Zionism, there's secular Zionism, there's religious Zionism, there's socialist Zionism, there was communist Zionism, but there can be also fascist Zionism. Now, what you suggest is true, but not in the sense that there was one sort of Zionism in the past and there's another Zionism today. What we have is, in this very kaleidoscopic, pluralistic view of Zionism, that the liberal and socialist Zionism was hegemonic. And the right-wing Zionism, which was identified with Jabotinsky, with Begin, with the Likud, with the Cherut party, was always in minority. Until 1977, Menachem Begin, who was head of the right-wing nationalist Zionist party, lost 7 elections. And the party was a small party, then larger, and it won the elections in 1977. So it's not a Zionism, and one shouldn't really, make it into an abstraction. But the Zionist movement, which split and had internal debates in the 30s and 40s, exactly on the axis of moderate, liberal, universalist, or ethnocentric varieties, the internal balance changed. And I agree with you that the balance today of the hegemonic Zionism is that of the right-wing Zionism, which puts the left wing in a difficulty, and this is part of the difficulty which comes up or will come up if there's going to be serious negotiations whether Labour should join the the government and whether it will have a chance of moving a little bit the hegemonic right-wing Zionism towards the center, if not towards the left. It's a complicated argument. And there are two reasons why of the change. One is the 1967 war. One of the dividing lines between liberal and socialist Zionism on one hand and the right-wing revisionist Zionism, as it was called, Jabotinsky, was whether Zionism, the Zionist movement, should accept partition of historical Eretz Israel, Palestine to two states, a Jewish and an Arab one. The liberal and social democratic majority at that time accepted it. And that's why Israel accepted the partition, well, the Jewish community, the Zionist movement in its majority, accepted the partition of 1947, which the Arabs refused to accept and went to war against and lost the war. The right wing, and one of the reasons why the right wing was so weak in the 1950s and 60s, in the beginning 60s, was because of the success story of the State of Israel in a partitioned land of Israel. And the idea was that the argument about partition is finished. The United Nations legitimated an existence of a Jewish state in part of Palestine. Israel was able to maintain it, to win the war, and was a success story basically with all its internal problems. The fact that Israel in 1967 conquered the West Bank in a war that was a defensive war in the Israeli mind, it was not aimed at controlling the West Bank as such, but because the internal dynamism of the situation, if you control an area for 40 or 50 years, which is what now Israel now controls the West Bank, it changes perceptions. And today it appears that the partition argument, which was won by the center-left, is now won in a different way by the right, that did not accept partition, but lived with it. So this is one thing. So the 67 war, and many in Israel now realize it might have been a glorious war, a great victory, etc., and Israel was saved from annihilation, all those things. This is part of the picture. The other picture is it reversed the argument about partition and gave to the right wing that was against partition a very visible vehicle. When Begin was in opposition for 30 years, they never accepted partition, but they never suggested to go to war in order to liberate East Jerusalem. But it's one thing to say we're not going to go to war to liberate the Wailing Wall. It's another thing to say if you control the Wailing Wall, or Hebron, or Jericho, for 50 years, to give it up. This is politically, psychologically, a very different thing. This is one issue. The other issue has to do, and I have to say it very carefully because it's sensitive, the change of the Israeli Jewish population. The liberal and social democratic nature of part of Zionism was maintained mainly by immigrants to Israel who came from Europe and brought with them the liberal and social democratic tradition. I mean, Begin also came from Europe, came from this country, but he brought with another tradition. Begin, in my mind, is a mirror image of the Endecja. And he grew up in the 1930s in Poland with Endecja anti-Semitism, and then one of the responses is to be the mirror image. So Begin didn't come from anywhere, but also from Europe, but the Europe of the 1920s, especially Poland in the 1920s and 30s, which is problematic for some parts of Jewish memory. The population in Israel today is very different, the Jewish population. About 40% of Israeli Jewish population of Israel is made up of immigrants coming from Arab countries. And they bring with them a relatively traditional view of the world. I mean, secularization has not gone very far in the Arab Muslim world and didn't go very far among Jews in the Muslim world. And for them, the Arabs are the historical oppressors. And you hear it many times, especially during the tensions with somebody like Yasser Arafat. Well, we know we know the Arabs, we know them from Iraq and we know them from Morocco. To put it in a nasty way, if Israel would be surrounded by 22 Ukrainian states, I think that a lot of Ashkenazi Israelis, even very liberals, would not be very enthusiastic about the right of Ukrainian to self-determination. Because to many Israeli Ashkenazis, the Ukrainians, Khmelnytsky, etc., this is part of the memo. This is part of history. The other group, 1 million people, are people who came from the former Soviet Union. They were an enormous contribution to Israeli high-tech, to music, to academia, to research, wonderful, to culture. But they were in a way, all of them, well, not all of them, many of them were really homines sovietici, in the sense that you believe in a strong state, in a sense that you never give up. To give you one example, Natan Sharansky, who refused his civil rights, human rights activist, but when he came to Israel, eventually he joined the Likud. He's not religious. Most Russian immigrants are not religious. Many of them are even not Jewish by halakha, etc., but they're not religious. Very few of them live in the West Bank, because even Tel Aviv is considered to them provincial compared to Moscow and St. Petersburg, so you don't want to live on top of a hill surrounded by Arabs. But they brought with them some traditions from the former Soviet Union. Many of them immigrated in the 80s, and they grew up on Soviet propaganda that, again, to put it bluntly, the Jews are wrong and the Arabs are right. So they knew this was Soviet propaganda, so they came to Israel and they learned, and they imagined that, well, because Soviet propaganda said this, the Arabs are wrong and the Jews are 150% right. So this was part of the transformation. Secondly, they came a little bit, and I'm saying it, one should never generalize, but many of them imbibed the Russian racist attitude towards blacks. And blacks are Uzbeks and Caucasian and Chechens, so the Arabs belong to this category. And they came with the idea of a strong state. Natan Sharansky, in an election campaign in the 1990s, made a speech which became almost canonical in Israel. He made the point that countries do not give up territories. Example, the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, huge country, strong country, world power, nuclear power, doesn't give up 3 small islands off the Japanese coast, because you don't give up territory. So we should give up Judea and Samaria, which are not 3 small islands in the middle, etc., historical. Most Israelis had never heard about the Kuril Islands. The next day, the major Israeli newspaper, especially the Yot Achonot, had a huge map of the Kuril Islands. And the Kuril Islands became an argument in the Israeli debate about the Palestinians, the settlements, and the West Bank. You can say crazy, okay, but if you have 1 million people to whom the Kuril Islands was a symbol of statehood, it's an argument. So one of the reasons that the balance in Israel has shifted, it's not that the Zionism, the social liberal Zionism, is not there. The Labour Alliance received 23 seats in parliament. I mean, this is small, this is not good enough. There are also other centrist parties. Not everybody is Likud and to the right of Likud, but the balance has shifted. It has shifted because of the changes after 67, for better or for worse, and because of the demographic changes within the Jewish population in Israel. Let me just add one thing about the Israeli elections I forgot. It was the first time we have in these elections a phenomenon which is novel in Israeli parliamentary and political life, and it's still open-ended. In the last Knesset, the right-wing majority, and the previous Knesset has a right-wing majority, succeeded in raising the threshold of how many votes you need in order to get into the Knesset from 2.5 to 3.25. And it was aimed by the right-wing explicitly in order to hit the 4 different Arab parties that were represented in the Knesset. Each of them had 2 or 3 members of the Knesset, one had 4. So the idea was to make it difficult for those Arab parties to enter the Knesset. Very nasty and very racist right-wing plot, but it worked. But it worked in a dialectical way. It pushed all the 4 Arab parties to unify, and for the first time in this election you didn't have 4 Arab parties, but you had a united Arab list, which got 13 or 13?
Yes.
Yeah, 13 members in the Knesset, 2 more than they had separately in the previous elections. Now, the 4 Arab parties, and I have to understand how dramatic this is. The 4 Arab parties, one was communist, one was Islamic fundamentalist, one was Palestinian nationalist, and one was Nasserist. So, I mean, they had very deep divisions. And there were good reasons for them not to be united, because they had the Arab society in Israel is as pluralistic as the Jewish society. However, under pressure, they united, and it's not a very easy union. Communist and Islamic fundamentalists, you know, 2 members of the Knesset are polygam, Islamists who have more than 1 wife, which is illegal, but it's a fact. And one of them is a very strong Arab nationalist woman, Hanan Zouabi. Very feminist and very powerful. So whether it's going to hold together, I think they're going to hold together because there's an interest. But they elected, for the first time, a very unusual leader. Ayman Uda. He's a communist. He's a doctor. He's the first Arab-Israeli leader who studied outside of Israel. He studied medicine in Romania, perhaps not the best place. But he brings a vision which is a little bit less provincial than the vision of the former Arab, the other Arab leaders. And he made a very clear statement that we are here in order to become part of the political discourse. We're not just going to criticize, we're going to try to contribute to the political discourse, which was very dramatically different from what previous Arab Israeli leaders were saying, because they had to compete for their electorate. So there was a competition who is going to be more critical of not only government policies, but of Israel, and Zionism, etc., etc. And he said, we are here, we have our claims, we have our agenda, we insist on equal rights, we insist on participation, we insist on budgetary equality between Jews and Arabs, and legal equality. There are serious problems, but we are here in order to be part of the discourse, and not just to make Jews angry. This was very symbolically evident at the opening of the Knesset. The Knesset opening, like in many other countries, starts with the singing of the national anthem. Now, the national anthem is Hatikva, which is a Jewish Zionist anthem. So all members of the Arab party, all 12 of them, went out of the hall. Quite not easy for the Jewish majority, you know, to swallow it. It's part of the open society. But Ayman Uda remained and stood, and he didn't sing. Why should he sing? But he said, I mean, this is the official anthem of the country of which we are citizens. We may oppose it, but we are doing it with it. So for the first time, and this is now the 3rd largest party in the Knesset, if there would have been a Labour-led government, the United Arab List would probably not join the government, but would support it from outside. Now, with this different situation, we do not know. But if you want to ask me which one is the Israeli political party or list to watch, it's this list. Because it may change the discourse, it may make things for the Jewish majority perhaps even more difficult, because it's much more easier to depict the Arab members as being anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, what have you. It's much more difficult when you need their vote in order to pass legislation, and they are being part of the process. So that's another aspect which I think has not received enough attention outside of Israel. Should make for question.
No. Thank you very much. There are, let's say, 3 persons. They will pose the question and you will answer afterwards, okay? Would anybody, there's Patricia Zastar, Piotr Buras and Rafał Szybczak. For the moment, I have 3 names. Is there anybody else who would like to pose the question? Say something. If not, let's start with Patricia, please.
Thanks. Thank you. I'd like to ask about your point number 2, the Middle East. About the Middle East, your point number 2. I'll try to comment very briefly and then make a question out of my comment. So I do see a point in emphasizing 1916 and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, obviously, but there's also a risk in emphasizing that particular argument, because we may lose the perspective of the past 100 years, what happened in between, and in particular the last 30 years. And these were the years of really fast changes, societal changes mostly, in the Middle East and in the Arab world. So just to give you an illustration, Egypt was in 1980 when Mubarak, 81, when Mubarak was becoming the president, was half the number of the people that it is now. And actually there are electricity cuts today, but 50% of Egyptians do have internet access. These are the new data that we know, and 96% of households do have a TV set. So there's a disparity between what the governments want to do and what the society is becoming. 75% of all Arabs were born the earliest in the 80s. So they have no memory, not to mention, no, they don't have any understanding, not to mention memory of the Ottoman Empire, of what happened in the 30s or 40s when the countries were created. So my point is this: there are two countries now in the Middle East, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that are trying to stick to the old state system or the Westphalian system, and these are the two countries that were created out of their own will by Ibn al-Saud and Wahhab in Saudi Arabia, and obviously Egypt, and the rest are more or less artificial creations, as you pointed out. So these are the two countries that, because of the dangers around, will not reform, but will become even more authoritarian and dictatorial than they are now. And actually Saudi Arabia is, to my mind, not a moderate Arab state. I mean, it may be moderate in terms of politics.
Did I say moderate or not?
The moderate camp or the moderate states.
Did I use it?
I think you did, because I underlined it, but maybe it was...
No, some other people said moderate.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia is the most repressive country in the Middle East.
Exactly.
More repressive than Iran. Okay.
But it's important for my question about Israel, actually, when I will add Israel to it. So, on the one hand, these governments, Saudi and Egyptian governments, will become more dictatorial because of necessity, because of what they want to do in the region right now politically. And on the other hand, we have societies that are exposed to different models of living through the media, etc. So the gap between the two is becoming wider and wider. And now when you add, now in order to shorten the gap, make it smaller, you would need to reform socially within, which is impossible at the moment. Now if you add Israel to it, Israel is becoming more dependent on these two countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and less dependent, maybe, out of this isolation on Europe. So you didn't raise the point of increasing isolation of Israel in the international arena, but I think it might be problematic for Israel in the coming years and decades, maybe, if it's more dependent on those states in the Middle East rather than the usual friends coming to the topic of the panel itself. So where do you see Israel in 30 years' time?
Okay, thank you. Piotr.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on your somewhat cautious, if not even critical, assessment of the Iran deal. Because I was struck a little bit, maybe I misinterpret your remarks as criticism as such of this framework agreement. But my question would be, don't you think that you set the hurdle a little bit too high when you mentioned, for example, that this agreement should also tackle the issue of the Iran missile development? And of course I can absolutely follow your reservation or your sort of limited hope that this deal would work out. It certainly involves lots of pitfalls and open questions. But my question would be, in general, all in all, from the Israeli perspective, is it good that this deal has been done? Or would the alternative, do you see any better alternative for the deal as it has been designed? And don't you think that if this deal had not been reached, the risk of a nuclear arms race in the region would pose a real threat also for the stability and security of Israel? And my second question goes in a similar direction as Patricia's. I would like to ask you about your assessment of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. in light of this changing environment in the Middle East? Because my impression is that these, from the outside perspective, the Israeli-Palestinian issue's importance is somewhat in the international politics is decreasing. Paradoxically, maybe it's still very important, still tense, but the other issues on the agenda, like the ISIS and terrorism, the unraveling Middle East, all these issues you were talking about are clearly more urgent. And so my question is, to what extent this changing environment changes the importance and perspectives of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Thank you.
Thank you, Ramo.
My question is different than before. My question is about future. About future. About not about tomorrow, but about day after tomorrow. Because, of course, I do not have your insight about current situation, but I think that for me it's pretty clear about tomorrow in the year, 2 years, 3 years. As you said, we would have no solution of Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I believe that this issue will be of less importance for the world, not for Israel, but for the world. Of course, we will have big instability within Middle East. It's clear. Europe will be still not a friend of Israel. The closest friend of Israel in Europe is going to be Poland. So it means that it's not about Poland; it's about Europe. And about states will be still friend of Israel, not the same way like it was before. So it's clear for me. But my question is about future in 10 years. Something I know that to predict in such perspective is impossible. It's kind of a question. But I don't. The question is not about situation, but about kind of long-term goal for Israel, or long-term idea, which could be kind of point of orientation. Because I believe in a pretty unstable world and within deeply unstable region, such idea is more than important because of current instability. So that is my question about your opinion about such question.
Maybe I will add one heavy question towards the end. Do you believe still in two-state solution? And now, developing a few sentences developing this subject, which is largely discussed, of course, which was rising already by somebody who was not very leftist. This is Ari Sharon. That conviction that you cannot have democratic state and at the same time the state where one nation is dominated totally, another nation with very different status, political status. It's used abusively the term of apartheid as describing the tendency of development of Israeli society, but this is the problem. If there's no any ideological type of apartheid, although you are mentioning yourself elements of racist appearing stronger today than 20 or 30 years ago in Israeli politics. So can you see with demographic changes, which now several hundred Jews living in the West Bank, can you see peaceful establishment of two states, historical, let's say, Palestine? And the last sentence, especially that it seems it was shocking during the social big movements in 2011, which was powerful, but it was social. The question of Palestinians was not raised at all. But the young people who are usually idealistic, and when the problem of Palestine was always present in the Israeli politics, in a way it was evacuated from the consciousness also.
And you mentioned that this is not only internal, this is also external problem, that Palestinian question is playing much more limited role in the Middle East in general than historically. The combination of those factors, don't you think that this is the source of anxiety? Thank you.
Well, let me start by answering your question. Source of anxiety, yes, and sort of unease, great unease, yes. That's not enough. You say young people are idealistic, yes. Young people are idealistic and they can be also fascist as idealistic. Okay, so to imagine that young people are always on the right, which means on the left side of politics, this is not so. So, now the social protests suggested that had a very important impact. It was not the social protest of the proletariat or the weakest elements in Israeli society. It was a social protest of young, middle-class, bourgeois, well-educated, well-situated people whose aspirations were higher than their abilities, financial abilities. And it hurt. And it happened that for the first time, security and defense and Palestinians and the war were not at the center of the political discourse. But when it comes to election, you still have those issues because they are, if you wish, either existential or very, very powerful. Now, I have no doubt that the two-state solution is the only solution if we think about solution. But I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not a determinist. Is it going to happen? I hope so. But in order to happen, you need a lot of changes, not only in Israel, but also on the Palestinian side. Because for the Palestinian side, and I have to say, there's somebody from the left who has no problem, with a two-state solution. I have no problem of evacuating 300,000 Israeli settlers from the West Bank. They shouldn't have been there in the first place. But I have to understand that politically it's very difficult to do it. Because it's very difficult as part of a peace process to evacuate 7% of your own population from a contested area. Not that it shouldn't be done. So, I mean, it's very easy to make the difficulties personal. It's all Netanyahu. I mean, Netanyahu, we owe him a terrible debt for undermining his chances for a solution. But there is something beyond it. And all Israeli governments, left government, center government, had negotiated with the Palestinians. And Oslo, which should have been, we are 25 years after Oslo, which should have been the beginning of the process, was stuck. Because the first stages were easier. The other stages are difficult. And it has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, and I'm saying it with a bleeding heart, the issue is not borders, and the issue is not occupation as such. The issue is legitimacy. Whenever I meet a Palestinian, and you know, we meet them all over the place, I ask, before we get into discussion on the issues, I have a question to you. It's a simple question, it's a complicated question, you may say it's an unfair question, but it has only two answers. One is yes, or everything else that is not yes is no. What's the question? Do you think that Israel is a legitimate state? Until now, I have not met one Palestinian who gave me a yes answer. I had all kinds of answers. Some were very honest and said no. And I understand. I mean, for the Palestinians, Israel is illegitimate. I understand it. People were saying if Israel changes its national anthem, if it changes its state emblem, if it changes its flag, if it changes its views, I said, okay, you're telling me no. Criticism of Israel, I have no problem with that, but the question is legitimacy. And until now, we have a problem on that issue. So when you ask yourself, why did all the negotiations break down? They didn't just break down over a period of 25 years because of issues of disagreement about the borders. For the Palestinians, the issue of return, the right of return of all Palestinians who either expelled or left Israel in 1948, their right to return to Israel, is a cornerstone of their national identity. Imagine, and I'm saying it in Poland, imagine that all the Germans who were kicked out of Poland after 1945 would insist, and the German government would insist that they have a right to return to Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. There would be no peace in Europe. There is a problem here. I understand. I mean, look, when we were still able to go to Gaza, I once attended the opening ceremony of a kindergarten in Gaza. 4-year-old children in the UN camp. And everyone, child was given a huge metal key and told, this is the key, and everyone understood it's symbolic, this is the key to your grandfather's house or field or orchard, and you're going to get it back. Now, as a Jew, as an Israeli, I am deeply moved, because I know what it means to be a refugee, and I respect that feeling. But it's not helpful to the peace process. If you educate 4 generations on this, imagine all the expellees in Germany would be educated in Bavaria or wherever they are, but they're going to come back to, well, okay, I'm Poland, we know what we're talking about. There is a problem here which goes very deep, and therefore, as a solution, yes, this is the only solution. Do I think the political situation at the moment on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side is helpful towards that solution? I'm afraid no. Do I give up? Does the center left give up the idea? No. Now, what we do have is a situation which is a very complex one on the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza is not occupied by Israel anymore. No Israeli can go into Gaza. Gaza is under siege from Israel and from Egypt. Very complicated. But Gaza is run not by the Palestinian Authority. Gaza, 1.5 million people, are run by Hamas, for better or for worse. In the West Bank, you've got Jewish settlers who shouldn't be there, but the Arab major centers like Ramallah and Nablus and Jenin and Bethlehem Hebron are run by the Palestinian Authority. No Israeli government is there. No Israeli military government is there. They are under a lot of Israeli pressure. They're not part of Israel, and they're not going to be annexed to Israel for a very simple reason, because if it's going to be annexed, it's going to be something like apartheid. So we have a situation which is extremely complex, extremely oppressive to the Palestinians, and extremely corrupting the Israeli discourse and the Israeli way in which Israel runs its army. But at the moment, I see very little changes unless we begin to understand that, like in Cyprus or Kosovo or Bosnia, the alternative to a final status solution is not necessarily war. You can find partial agreements. You can find steps towards a better situation. And, you know, the Kosovo issue was not solved, but there have been in the last few years a number of developments. In Cyprus, Nicosia is still the divided city, but people can move from one side to another, which was done unilaterally by the Turkish side. This seems to me at the moment the most pragmatic possibility. This is not what I'd like to see. I'd like to see much more. Let me briefly answer the various questions. Because there is now a stalemate, I can imagine that the Palestinians are going to move ahead by trying to internationalize some of the aspects of the conflict. United Nations, the Hague International Criminal Court, going to happen. It's going to cause Israel enormous harm. But I think the Palestinians have an illusion that they think it's going to bring them an independent state. An independent state, for better or for worse, is achievable only through negotiations with Israel. And if negotiations don't work, we have to look at other alternatives. To imagine that you can create a Palestinian state in 67 borders by United Nations resolution, this is, again, rhetorically okay, in international law okay, enormous damage to Israel. Is it going to give the Palestinians what they deserve, an independent, sovereign state? No. This can be done only by negotiations with Israel. This is the reality. So I think one has to be realistic about that. On the issue of the Iranian agreement, I was skeptical. I think that one of the damages done to Israel and to the case by Netanyahu was by exaggerating the issue, comparing Ahmadinejad to Hitler. This is another Holocaust. I mean, the Iranian issue is a very serious challenge to Israel. But by the kind of hyperbolic language and demagogic exaggeration used by Netanyahu, he undercut a lot of the arguments which have to do not with my criticism, but the points that I raised as skepticism. Those are legitimate issues that have to be addressed. I hope they're going to be addressed in the next stage of the negotiation. And I think the Europeans, which have been very mute, I mean, after all, the agreement is not an American-Iranian agreement, it's 5+1. And either the European Union or the individual European countries I think, if they agree that those issues are legitimate issues, things are legitimate, they have to be raised. Israel, not now, but the day after tomorrow, I'm a little bit a burnt realist. If I don't know what tomorrow is, I have great difficulty to think in the day after tomorrow. A lot of things will depend in the immediate future about what kind of government Israel is going to have and how the Iranian agreement will work out. I fear, I dread a situation in which there will be an agreement with Iran that will not address those issues which I think I raised. This is not going to minimize the dangers of war, it's going to, not to maximize, but it's not going to minimize the dangers of war, and I dread it. In order to have an agreement that will create stability, it has to be an agreement that is enforceable. And from what I know, and there's a little I know, because very few of us know what's happening, because we have heard two versions already, so we have a problem here. The agreement as it appears to now seems to me a paper agreement and not an enforceable one, unless I'm wrong, and I'd be very happy to be wrong. To the set of questions raised about the Arab world. I think all of what you said about the demographic changes in the Arab world and the young generation doesn't have memories of Ottoman, you're obviously right. But the point is that the Sykes-Picot countries are disintegrating. And you are right that the countries like Egypt, and which is a dictatorship, and Saudi Arabia, which is the most repressive country in the Middle East, much more repressive than Iran, which people should realize, Israel is not dependent on them. No, of course not. But from the Israeli point of view, there is a certain realignment. And the realignment is that for a country like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the most important issue in their foreign policy is not just a Palestinian issue, it's always there, it's not going to be forgotten, but it is the kind of tension with what's happening in the post-Sykes-Picot countries. And what's happening in the Sykes-Picot countries, you're right about Egypt and Saudi Arabia, they're repressive and reactionary, but the alternative is not a democratic Syria and not a democratic Iraq, but it's ISIS or disintegration. So from the Israeli point of view, the fact that there is no Syria anymore and there is no Syrian army raises and enhances Israeli security. We may have problems with Nusra or with Al-Qaeda or even with Daesh on the border with the Golan Heights. But it's very different from the kind of threat which was faced by Israel when Syria had a strong army supported by the Soviet Union, developing nuclear capability which the Olmert government put an end to, and having poison gas, which it doesn't have now because of the agreement with the West, with very strong Russian support. The agreement. So, about what kind of Middle East are we talking? And when it comes to younger people, to imagine that younger people will necessarily always vote the economic interest, that if they are unemployed or unemployable and feel disempowered, that they will always support a democratic alternative, some of them may support a dictatorial religious alternative because it gives them a feeling of empowerment. I mean, one of the reasons, and I think people who study the Middle East should not forget it, ISIS is extremely popular among many younger people. There have been even Israeli Arab volunteers who crossed the border barriers and some of them were killed, fighting with ISIS. Why? It gave them the feeling of empowerment, that we can fight in the West. And this is one of the differences between the Arab Spring and what happened in this area in 1989, 1990. When the Arab Spring started, there was even, I think, a Polish delegation going to Egypt trying to help the Egyptian young demonstrators how to deal with the situation of confronting a dictatorial regime. There's one difference, and this difference explains up to a point that the development in the Arab countries was different from what it was in these areas here. For Solidarność, for Carta, what was it, 68? 77 in in Czech Republic, for MDF in Hungary, etc., the West was the alternative. America, democracy, was the alternative. In the Arab world, democracy is viewed as something imposed from the West. America is not exactly the model. America is hated by many Arab and Muslim people. And this explains the great achievement of the Muslim Brotherhood. The fact that in the first open, free elections in Egypt, a huge amount, more than 75% voted either for Muslim Brotherhood or for the Salafis, 75%. At a time when, before the elections, I was in Egypt and talked to some of the Egyptian sociologists who are secular and basically Democrats and liberal, and they said the Muslims would get at maximum 25%. People voted their identity, including young people, when they hear that Islam is the answer, which is not specific, but it's very powerful. When then they hear some of the more secular economists explaining about development that may take 15 years, etc., this is very different. So the fact that especially in Egypt, which is a coherent society, in Egypt it was very clear to many of us, not because we wanted it, that the alternative is between the army and army rule and the Muslim Brotherhood. That the secular upper middle class demonstrators at the Tahrir Square, maybe 5% of the population. They are the elite of society, but they represent a very small group. And the army in Egypt, and one has to understand it, the army in Egypt is the most modernizing factor in Egyptian societies, and I think you will agree with it, since the time of the beginning of modernization under Muhammad Ali in the 19th century. The army was a vehicle of modernization, for better or for worse. The army in Egypt, after the 1967 war, some Israelis may not like it, but it's a fact. The army after 1973 gave Egyptians back the tribe, and therefore the army said the army and the people are one hand. They said something very deeply anchored in Egyptian national and popular consciousness. And therefore, and this is a terrible paradox, some of the people who demonstrated against Mubarak and brought him down found themselves 2 years later supporting a military coup by General or Field Marshal, now President Sisi, against the Muslim Brotherhood. Because when they had to choose an authoritarian military government, between that and an Islamic leadership that was telling them how to dress and how to speak and how to appear in public or how not to appear in public for women, etc., they made a choice. I do not envy them that kind of choice. But this, in reality, in civil society, the strongest element on one hand is the army, and on the other hand, the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is part of civil society. The Muslim Brotherhood played in Egypt the place that Solidarność played in this country. There was no Solidarność in Egypt. There was a Muslim Brotherhood. So the changes were others, and let me just add on a final comment. When you look at the Arab countries, there are 22 Arab members of the Arab League, or 23 if you count Palestine. The Arab Spring happened in a number of countries. It wasn't universal. Where did it happen? Where it brought down dictatorial regimes or challenged them. In Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Iraq it was brought down by the Americans, and in Syria the regime was challenged.
And Libya.
What's that?
Libya?
And Libya combination. Libya, of course. Now, all of those regimes, including Libya, have one thing in common. They were Republican regimes, ostensibly led by civilians who are military men who captured power by a military coup. Be it in Tunisia, be it in Libya, be it in Egypt, be it in Syria, be it in Yemen. Those were military dictatorships, not masquerading, but presenting themselves as republics. They were republics, but they were authoritarian military republics. What brought them down was not the degree of repression. Repression in Saudi Arabia is much deeper than it was in Egypt and Tunisia. It was because those governments did not have legitimacy. When they were challenged after relatively successfully running the country by a combination of the mukhabarat, the security services, and an ideology, they had no legitimacy. None of the dynastic governments, some of them much more repressive, were not challenged. With the exception of Bahrain, where there is a Sunni-Shia divide, is a different story. And you ask yourself, why is it? Saudi Arabia is more repressive. It has money, okay, so it can co-opt and corrupt people, there's no doubt about it. But Morocco is not a rich country, and Jordan is obviously a very not rich country. The dynasties in one way or another have legitimacy. It's not because I like it, this is the fact. Especially in countries like Morocco or Jordan, where the monarch and the dynasty are considered to be descendants of the Prophet. A Jordanian minister told us a few weeks ago that notice what's happening in Amman, the demonstrations against the government, against the prime minister, against the finance minister, against the budget, never against the king. You do not demonstrate against a descendant of the Prophet. You can demonstrate against Mubarak, who is sort of a general, and say the people want the change of the Nizam, the people want the change of the regime. You never heard that kind of word in Jordan. We don't demonstrate against the descendant of the Prophet. This is something the social scientists will just look at quantifiable factors, overlook. It's a normative factor. And Saudi Arabia is not just a rich country, but it is also a country which is custodian of the two holiest places of Islam, and is doing a relatively well job with millions of Hajjis, millions of pilgrims coming every year, and it's relatively done very well. So it has legitimacy. So the issue of legitimacy in the Arab world, beyond the statistical issue which you raise, which are universal in the Arab world, but the difference is between regimes that have legitimacy and those that do not have. In a very paradoxical way, especially to those of us who are secularists and liberal and democrats, etc., governments can be very repressive, but have legitimacy which is anchored in religion, not in fundamentalist Islam, but in a conservative, moderate interpretation of Islam, have legitimacy, and this is my final word, they have also the ability of co-opting people. The king in Jordan can co-opt a lot of opposition people because he has legitimacy. The king in Morocco was able to co-opt, and this is not headline news because there was no massive demonstration. When you look at the government of Morocco, the king co-opted socialists and Islamic fundamentalists into his government. How do you do it? When you have legitimacy, you can do it. So one has to look at the Arab world and the Middle East, not in the context of just trying to use analogies with the West, which is up to a point important, but the analogies have a limit. And one has to look at each of the Arab countries where there are social and demographic changes which are universal, but are institutional and normal difference very, very deeply. Thank you very much for your question.